Can a house keep its secrets when the plates shine like little moons and the hymn has barely left the throat? Can Easter grace cover the tally of 100 winters that never belonged to those who endured them? Can silence hide a covenant older than law, the covenant that patience makes with memory when no witness dares to write? The Manor's ribs groaned like an animal that had forgotten its name. The river outside wore its Sunday skin, still as ironed linen. Candles nodded, keys dozed on their ring like sleeping teeth, and somewhere between a pantry breath and a porch hinge, a promise that had been folded into a pocket for years began to unfold, like a letter that knew it would be read by fire. Pause here, at the edge of the threshold where wood learns to listen. This story walks softly, but it does not tremble. If you want to follow real stories that defy time and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our investigations. We go on with reverence, not celebration, because memory deserves a steady hand. If you're ready to hear what the walls finally said when someone taught them a new language, step closer. Morning came to Blackhow Manor as if it were hired. It clocked in at the same hour, carried the same tray of sounds. Rooster sorrow, pump handle prayer, the thin music of spoons striking the sides of tin cups, and walked the corridors of light with disciplined feet. The house, a cream-boned skeleton wrapped in white paint, woke with a cough of dust from drapery and the stiff-lipped yawn of shutters. It knew its lines, it knew the weather of command. The fields beyond were a sea of obedience, rows combed straight, each stalk a rib in the long chest of the land. When the wind ran its comb through those ribs, the field exhaled a low, grassy psalm that the legermen pretended not to hear. There was the great oak, its knuckles in the sky, its shade distributed like a singy stipend. Work began in the dark because darkness was cheaper. Boots found their paths without eyes. Hands, too, hands that remembered the heft of the hoe, the temperature of iron, the bite of rope. The day's first drink was always breath. The day's second came when the pump learned your name again. Memory lived in the tools. Axes held winter in their jaws. Brooms remembered the figures drawn on their backs. Needles caught between two lights, hearth and dawn. Learned the grammar of mending, which is the grammar of endurance. Sunday carried itself like a visiting judge. Even the dogs walked with restraint, as if baptized. The bell at St. Gabriel's, 2 miles off, marked out the distance between heaven and this place with a single iron syllable. Easter was a brighter syllable, the kind that dresses wounds in lace. The manor shined for it. Windows polished, candelabra tuned, the long table armoured with linen. Silver stood at attention like a polite army. The crystal coughed up its little rainbows. Somewhere a hymn laid its coat over a bruise. In the kitchen heat spoke an old, crowded language. Greece remembered every feast, each sorrow salted and stacked like pages. The ovens kept the liturgy of labour, opening and closing like lips that wouldn't confess. The women moved like the minute hand of a clock, deliberate, precise, inevitable. A shoulder pushed the door, a pan turned, a ladle whispered into broth. At the table in the corner, a mound of flour rose like an unhurried hill, while fingers measured patience against hunger and turned it into bread. The cook's apron wore a constellation of accidents, each star a revelation of the day's orbit. On the porch, the master tapped his cane to count clouds, the gesture of a man who thinks the sky is an employee. He was a ledger in boots, an addition of privileges, a subtraction on the lip, arithmetic in the fist. He called his kin by their Christian names and the enslaved by their functions, as if a soul could be filed under a task. The mistress, seeing Easter as a mirror in which her house must like its face, arranged flowers into obedient bouquets and forgave herself with the smell. Children ran like unrepentant commas at the edges of paragraphs they could not yet read. They learned, as all children do, the shape of the world by touching it, the cool metal of the banister, the rough velvet of the dog's ear, the surprising kindness of a plum when it breaks open. They learned the names their parents had for things and the names the house whispered at night. In the nursery, the rocking chair ticked the loom of time with a foot that had already forgiven itself. Silence was not the absence of noise. Silence was management. It lived in the space between orders and obedience, slept in the pocket of a foreman's voice, and woke in the eyes of those who knew that speech could be used against you like a nail. The quarters carried the heavy furniture of that silence. Even laughter had to be arranged so that it would not be heard lifting anything. Even grief learned to fold itself small, to be carried in the cheek like a secret coin. Easter week ripened slowly, its sweetness careful and public. Dye bowls and Sunday dresses, the bell's insistence, the muffled pride of shoes that had been polished with the same ore used for tombstones. The kitchen prepared for Easter supper with a reverence that felt like mourning. The menu had the weight of ceremony, meats lacquered into memory, vegetables confessing under steam, pies whose edges were crimped like guarded smiles. Each dish took its place, as if the table were a court, and the verdict was hunger. The evening laid a hand on the shoulder of the house and said, "Hush." The river agreed, the sun put its coins into the pockets of the trees. Lamps woke, their little sons domesticated and made to mind. Somewhere a whip-poor-will practised the only word it knew, which sounded, to some, like a prayer, and to others, like a record being kept outside the book. The manor leaned into its ritual. The chairs anticipated their burdens. The clock stretched, prepared to hold a long minute, and under the floorboards, under the recipes and the psalms, something counted a different calendar, one that had waited years to reach this date. My name is not the one in their mouths. The one in their mouths is a tool. The one that is mine is a... The scars on my back are a library organized by weather. Some raised white and calm as old river stones, some red when it rains, as if memory were water-soluble. The ledger they keep is clean, columns like soldiers, sums that never blush. The ledger I keep is under the tongue. The entries are not numbers, they are hours. They are hands, they are the names of the small things that were taken with a laugh, the big things taken with a law. There's the day my sister's braid was cut off and waved like a flag. There's the noon when my father's prayer was interrupted and harvested for sport. There's the winter my wife's cough turned to a verdict because a blanket was counted as theft. Each entry is dated by how the light looked when grief sat down. I am the one who sets the table for them. I iron the linen until it forgets its wrinkles. I make the silver remember its face. I count not just forks but the spaces between them, because spaces are where I live. When I place a spoon, I hear how it will sound against porcelain when a lie is told. When I fit a key into a lock, I feel how much it enjoys its purpose, the way a mouth enjoys a secret. I fold serviettes into the shape of gentility and pretend not to see the teeth inside. Silence is my best coat. I keep it brushed. I wear it every day because it never goes out of fashion and it fits in any room. Men consult themselves in my silence and think they hear agreement. Women place their burdens in my silence and think I have agreed to carry them. But my silence is not a vacancy. It is a ledger with blank paper on top and writing underneath. It is a field that looks empty until the wind moves and you see what's been planted. I learned patience from water. The river does not argue with rock. It collects it, grain by grain, and takes it along. I learned memory from thread. A seam will hold a shirt together for 100 washings if you respect its pull. I learned prophecy from creaking boards. A house speaks ahead of its feet. Nights in the kitchen, the oven door showing me my own face in a bloom of heat, I learned to read the language of smoke. Its commas, its stubborn vowels, its way of making even an honest room vague with doubt. Sometimes I write in the ledger without ink. I inventory not just injury but the method of it, the way the master's cane never strikes the same place twice, the way the mistress's charity arrives with an invoice, the way Sunday sermons pass the plate over our heads and call it blessing. I list the price of each bruise, not in dollars but in hours stolen from sleep, in songs left unsung, in the way a child learns to walk around a chair because a man might be in it. I had a brother once who laughed like a branch in a storm, loud and ready to break. His laughter got him noticed, and being noticed got him sent down river. The ledger has an entry for that. Not his name, gnomes vanish, the sound of his laugh. I write that sound down every spring when the frogs return, because I have to keep something alive that the river did not. I have a daughter whose hair smells like an orchard even in winter. The ledger keeps the day they weighed that hair in their eyes and found it heavy. It keeps the afternoon she saw a plate of sugared things she would never taste, and looked at me as if I had failed to invent mercy. Do not think the ledger is only sorrow. It keeps patience too, which is a kind of wealth. It keeps the moments we stole from harm, the cup of cool water handed at the exact right time, the stitch that saved a finger, the look that warned a friend to breathe smaller for a minute. It keeps the laughter that survived inside a hand, low and almost illegal, the kind that warms without light, and it keeps that page is heavy as iron and as quiet as bread rising. On Easter morning I carried the linen like a cloud that had agreed to descend. I touched each plate as if investing it with the memory of those it had refused. I listened to the chairs the way one listens to old men at a crossroads, and I said nothing because speech, here, is a borrowed thing that must be repaid with interest. But I moved in a way that told the ledger, I am listening for the hour when ink will not be necessary. The house had its moods. It sulked in the rain, it bragged in the cold, when the hearth made its bones glow. It flirted with spring, letting in light like a rumour. On this Easter it preened, the floorboards wore polish like armour. The staircase smiled with every tooth, the chandelier rehearsed its little constellation. But beneath the bright, a draught wandered like a question that had been mislaid. My hands felt it as I passed, the same way you feel the mood of a room that has decided something. The ledger turned its quiet page. I did not, and the page turned me. No one notices the ceremony of a servant because they think ceremony belongs to the visible, but ritual thrives in the unremarked. To lay a table is to draw a map. To lay it every day is to learn where the country is soft and where the borders will not hold. I began with objects that did not deny their purpose. Chains, knives, needle, fire, thread. Each has a truth it cannot help speaking. The chain in the smokehouse, rectangled and liver-dark from years of salted air, is a sentence without punctuation. It holds, it does not inquire. Its only verb is keep. I learnt to unhear that verb. I learned to make a chain think about itself. Touch the cold, and it admits winter. Lift the slack, and it remembers weight. Ask nothing of it for a season, and it grows curious. This is not instruction, it is translation. How iron considers patience. The knife is the servant of clarity. In the kitchen it divides onion from onion, meat from fat, poison from medicine. I respect knives the way I respect truthful men, carefully and with my eyes open. I honed edges, yes, but not for theatre, for the faith that a clean cut begins the long work of healing. The blade rides the whetstone like a pilgrim on a road it trusts. Steel sings a single word hymn, and I taught my hands to hear that hymn, and then to forget it, so that I could use the silence after. Needles are the shadows of bones. They know the short path through cloth. The thread they carry, obedient and long-suffering, is a river taught to be a bridge. I mended things that did not belong to me while thinking about the one seam in this house that the owner of the house did not know existed, the seam between what he believed the world to be and what it was willing, finally, to become. I practiced on calves and hems the way a man practices on prayer, more often than is necessary, because character lives in repetition. Fire is an alphabet. In the hearth it spells comfort. In the lamp it spells caution. In the field it spells hunger turned to labour. An ember is a period that refuses to end the sentence. In winter we coaxed letters from the embers until they became words again, warm and legible. I learned the grammar of flame without writing it down. There are things the tongue must not invent, but the eye remembers. The skin remembers. The house remembers most of all, especially in its dry places, where history splinters if you listen too hard. The thread sits quietly at the edge of all these. It speaks of repair, which is not forgiveness, and of continuity, which is not consent. I carried thread in my pocket like a modest inheritance. I preferred the dark colours. Light thread resents dirt. Dark thread understands work. Each spool turned slow as a planet when I touched it. I thought, planets do not hurry, they arrive. The ritual kept its calendar in ordinary gestures. Polishing the silver became a study of mirrors. I tilted platters and saw rooms inside rooms, flames doubled, faces ghosted. I learned how a reflection betrays the original by a fraction of a breath. I learned that a candle's twin in silver bends where the real is straight. I learned how the chandelier's little stars look sick in metal and holy in air. If a house had a soul, I thought, it would be caught somewhere between glow and gleam. Keys taught me about sleep. Their teeth are promises, their rings are collars. They hang from hooks like saints resigned to their niches. I weighed them in my palm and felt not power but habit. The master trusted them. The mistress feared misplacing them more than misplacing a person. I learned the sound each key makes when it enters its doctrine. I learned the small tremor of a bolt that knows it cannot forever say. The plan did not arrive as thunder. It arrived as lint, minute dismissed everywhere. It was in the way the west parlour breathed at dusk. It was in the habit of the butler to step away from the decanters precisely when the bell called his name. It was in the mistress's preference for lamplight heavy on fragrance and light on oil. It was in the staircase, the third step from the bottom, which complained more than it should have, as if rehearsing a testimony no one wanted. It was in the fact that Easter meant more candles than reason. I walked the house at hours when footsteps are forgiven. I carried trays, towels, linens, reasons. I measured the distance a voice can travel when it is dressed as duty. I memorized the behavior of curtains near flame, a jitter that pretends to be admiration. I watched the way the men gestured with their knives at supper, pointing the future toward whoever was not in the room. I counted too. Counting is prayer when no church will have you. How many locks, how many breaths between bell and door, how many heartbeats from kitchen to hall, if a man is already dying from something no one can name. Let me say it plain, there is an evil in instructions. They are a temptation for the small God in us who wants to be praised for methods. I will not make a ladder for harm. I will only say that I prepared as a field prepares for weather, receiving, storing, believing that a seed can out-argue a stone. I arranged what the day offered into a sentence the night would be willing to read. On the morning of Easter I moved through the hours like a needle through cloth, seen, unseen, seen again. I touched each room until it forgot me. I passed the pantry where jars sat like arrested seasons, summer peaches ambered into delay, July tomatoes made into a future someone else would enjoy. I breathed the prayer of yeast, which is hope that swells without being told. I laid a hand on the dining table, a ship about to sail under flags only it respected, and I promised the ledger, "We are near the shore." When the bell rang for the first setting, the house stood on tiptoe. The mistress walked like a verdict wrapped in silk. The master's cane announced him before his mouth did. The children arrived scrubbed to the bone, their halos braided by mothers who wanted the Lord to notice the neatness. Scent piled on scent until the room threatened to drown in good intentions. Candles were struck and little suns were stapled to time. The plan had only one demand, that I remain myself, that my face keep its habit, that my hands not betray their education, that I trust the years I had stored not to spill. A man is a jar. Some are meant to break, some are meant to pour, some are meant to hold the dark until someone needs it for light. I moved then, as all servants move in houses that think they are immortal, quiet as the arithmetic of a graveyard. I knew the hinges that remember winters. I knew the places where floorboards keep secrets like children keep marbles, tight-fisted and ready to lie. I knew which windows accept fog like an apology and which sharpen it into accusation. I knew how the door between kitchen and dining room behaved when it was asked to choose between warmth and display. I knew, above all, the rhythm of breath at a table when grace is said and no one means it. That was the hour the ledger had been grooming. That was the hour patience finished its schooling. The house had taught me everything it knew. Now the house would learn. The hymn ended, and the Amen fell like a coin into a well that refused to echo. Knives resumed their small sermons. Glass argued lightly with glass. Laughter took its seat at the head of the table and began carving the day into portions it did not deserve. The master lifted his cane to conduct the room, and then, forgetting he did not hold an orchestra, set it against the table's edge, where it could listen. I entered carrying a tray the way one carries a verdict, balanced, inevitable, without pride. No one considers the geometry of a tray. It is a moving altar. It is a moon you can command. It is a place where heat kneels. The candles bowed in my passing. Shadows rehearsed a panic they had not yet earned. The door breathed me into the room and closed behind me like a secret that does not trust its keeper. There is a moment in every house where all the walls are listening to the same sound. Tonight it was the dry cough of a beam addressing its fellows. The cough repeated, gentler than a warning, more insistent than a tick. It travelled down the spine of the staircase and settled under the silver. The mistress glanced up, a bird who has just remembered that sky can also be a mouth, then decided that good manners would not permit worry. The master did not hear. Men like him are trained to ignore the first ambassadors of consequence. I set the tray down. The room inhaled. That is when the house opened its throat and spoke in a language it had been forced, for decades, not to learn. The chandelier flickered as if someone had read a story it could not bear. The candles discovered how quickly mercy burns. Somewhere behind the wall a hush grew. What happened next is not to be told as a recipe, it is to be told as a psalm. Slow contralto, each line a rung on a ladder someone is not yet ready to climb. Light became a thing with legs. It walked along the moulding as if testing the case it would later make. Curtains, always eager for a dance, offered themselves to motion and found they had chosen a partner who did not stop. The air changed its mind. It no longer wanted to serve. Voices rose, not yet in fear, in etiquette. Open a window, fetch the words broke into vowels, and vowels into sound, and sound into breath, which is the first currency a body spends when it begs for survival. The children watched the room grow a second sky, one that writhed. The mistress held her napkin to her face the way a woman in a painting holds grief. I did not hurry. Hurrying is show. I stood where the floor knew my weight and the door knew my back. I watched the beam negotiate with itself and lose. I watched the table learn it had been a raft all along. I watched silver run toward its own reflection and fail to arrive. The house made a sound I had never heard from any animal, something between a bless and a break. It was the noise a ledger makes when someone writes in it with a map. Heat became a spokesman. It said everything that had been unsayable in this county since it learned to pronounce cotton. It spoke for the forefathers and the ones who will come asking why their names are spelt in ash. It spoke for the women whose throats had been taught to swallow their own sentences. It spoke for the men whose hands, catalogued by scars, had earned a Sabbath that never materialized. It spoke for the children whose games had been inventory, and it spoke, too, for the house which had been hired to keep the wrong story standing. The master tried the voice of command and discovered it had gone out of season. Ordered melted in his mouth like sugar too near a stove. He looked for the cane, that punctuation mark he had used to end other people's sentences, and found it useless against a paragraph of flame. He called my name, the one that is not mine, and I did not answer. Silence had filed for emancipation and been granted a provisional decree. Glass broke like a choir that's been told to stop singing and refuses. The great portrait of the family, oil faces confident as a rhythmic warp, until the father's smile looked like a scar and the mother's ringed hands like manacles. The children in the paint learned in an instant how quickly a halo can be a noose if you turn the picture the wrong way. The piano's voice boiled inside itself. Keys popped like teeth in a jailer's dream. I saw then what no one had ever seen. The floorboards wanted to run. They strained against their nails, each plank remembering the forest it had been forced to forget. The nails held their sermons, but they sweated. The banister whispered apologies to every palm it had escorted into power. The clock tried to swallow its own minutes and choked, and under all of it a hush, the hush that lives in the marrow of a people who have waited so long for the world to choose a new tense. Past perfect no longer fit. Present continuous wanted its due. Future conditional hovered like a doorway. If, it said, if. The first scream did not belong to a person, it belonged to paint. The second to lace. The third to a hymn that understood it had been used as scaffolding for a lie and wanted down. After that, voices, men with their names on papers, women with their names on rings, children whose names were still inventions. They converged on the single command all bodies eventually obey. I did not block the door, I did not hold it open. I stood to the side like a memory and let the house teach them the last lesson, that objects remember their masters, but they also remember their makers, and the maker of a house is not the man with the deed. It is the hands that taught wood to be roof, stone to be cornerstone, thread to be tablecloth, and those hands, in this hour, had elected a new governor. Flame took the staircase in a single sentence. It pronounced each step by name and then relieved it of duty. The chandelier shed its stars and became, for one dazed minute, a field. The table, true to its destiny as ship, drifted into a sea that parted for no one. The master stumbled and found himself equal to the dog, which is to say, mortal and afraid. The mistress kissed a Bible she had not read and tasted smoke on the Psalms. I stepped backward into a corridor I had mapped with my bones long ago. The corridor opened into night where air had not yet learned a new alphabet. The sky breathed me like a reed. On the lawn, neighbours began to collect like rumours, their faces lit by the kind of awe that looks so much like respect you could mistake it for kinship. They spoke their half-mercies in half-words. Tragedy, accident. The house behind me said the only word that could possibly answer, enough. Silence at last unbuttoned its coat and let its true body out. Not emptiness, but decision. No cheer, no gloat, only the roar of something long caged, discovering its legs. Morning misremembered itself. It came too early and too bright, as griefs often do. The manor stood in the field like a bad tooth finally pulled, aching, empty, and strangely honest. Smoke lay low, a tired animal. Ash drifted down the lane with the patience of snow that has forgotten to be cold. Birds tried their scales and found the key unsuitable. The neighbours convened a committee of rumour. They dressed it in good coats and called it concern. At the edge of the ruin, a deacon lifted his hat to God, and then kept his eyes on the ground, as if heaven were more forgiving than soot. Words arranged themselves into comfortable pairs. Unfortunate accident, divine testing, wicked sabotage. No one had evidence, everyone had certainty. They talked about the mistress's bravery and the master's losses, the way men talk about weather, as if it had not been farmed by human hands. Newspapers arrived hungry. Their mouths were large rectangles that demanded to be fed with certainty. They wrote in the voice of distance, conflagration at Black Her, Easter supper tragedy, heroic efforts by family and friends. They spelled the master's name correctly and the enslaved as a plural, anonymous as fog. One paper interviewed a portrait salvaged from the nursery and quoted its cracked smile. None interviewed the floor that had wanted to run. In the quarters, the hush learned to walk among us like a relative back from a war we were not allowed to name. We spoke in the tenders of the tongue, bread, water, winter, child. We kept our eyes trained on practicality so that no one would see the cathedral that had suddenly opened in our chests. A woman sewed with a speed no seamstress should attempt, as if stitches could hold back questions. A man whittled a spoon to keep his hands from inventing testimony. Children rehearsed innocence to a degree that made the older ones look away. At night the river did not change its mind. It carried the same moon, the same cold, the same reluctant stars. But it sounded different to those who had ears newly baptized by the roar of a house unmaking itself. The river said, "I told you patience was a kind of blade." It said, "What you bury is not always dead." It said, "There are logs that remember the forest more than the fire." We listened without nodding. To nod is a confession in some counties. The master decamped to a cousin's estate where grief could be rehearsed as if for a stage. He arrived with an inventory of losses measured in furniture and china, a sorrow that fit in a carriage. He wrote letters to men who spelt sympathy as credit. He stood at the far window and looked toward the place where something had stopped behaving like property and started behaving like weather, and he called it unforgivable. This is how ledgers speak when they are asked to account for pages they did not authorize. The mistress took to bed with psalms that had been frisked for comfort. She hummed in the region of forgiveness without quite arriving there, because forgiveness is a town that charges tolls. She held the Bible as if it might instruct the day to return to its old shape, but days, once untrained, invent their own gait. Her children drew houses with too many doors or none at all. They asked where the staircase had gone. She told them up was still available, just not here. Among us, names we had not used in years were unwrapped like saved cloth. We said the ones who had been sold, and the ones whose graves had been hurried, and the ones who had taught us to listen harder than the lesson. We spoke in halves and quarters because whole truth is a feast that kills before it heals. We kept our language lit by wicks, not bonfires, and let the elders pour water on any spark that looked eager to perform. Legends were not yet born. They were being carried. They kicked sometimes. A travelling preacher came, drawn by ash the way moths are drawn by the rumour of flame. He wanted to gather us into a sermon about affliction and reward. We allowed him his stage because a man who loves his voice will eventually say something useful just to hear it said. He talked about Job until Job looked tired. He talked about Egypt until Egypt looked modern. He talked about deliverance and made it sound like a schedule. When he left, the air felt lighter, as it often does when a man's certainty moves on. The sheriff counted footsteps and found astonishingly that ours added up to nothing he could use. He asked us questions like nets, hoping to pull from the water a fish that wanted to be caught. We gave him reeds, we gave him minnows, we gave him the tide. He folded his hat and unfolded it. He knew what the newspapers wanted him to say. He knew what the House had said in a language he could not take to court. I went on with my duties in a world that had been rearranged while pretending not to be. Work continued because hunger is not a philosopher. I mended what could be mended, a shirt that had watched a fire, a chair whose rung had learned mortality, a harness that had mistaken mastery for eternity. Thread moved obediently, the needle's eye a narrow gate through which repentance might pass if it had the right kind of humility. Some nights I dreamed of the chandelier falling in slow confession, each crystal a syllable that spelled the names of the gone. Some nights I dreamed of the staircase unspooling like ribbon back into the trees. Often I dreamed nothing at all, which is a mercy men rarely acknowledged. When I woke, my hands remembered to be still. That too is a kind of prayer. bloomers learned to walk upright. They put on boots and called themselves history. One said the stove rebelled, another that the master, drunk on Lent, had courted his own ruin. Another, spoken in the careful voice of those who like their fear tidy, suggested a foreign hand. A stranger on the road, a left-behind match, a wind with opinions. No rumour said patience had run out of places to hide and chosen, at last, to speak with an element that does not bow. I wrote in the ledger with nothing, just breath. I recorded a balance that did not show on paper. I put a line under certain names and lifted others into a margin where the eye rarely goes but the heart always reads. I added silence and found that it yielded a number too large for their mathematics. Then I closed the book that no one knows I carry and placed it back where it lives. Behind the ribs, under the creak-smelling name, in the room with no door. Years later, when spring learns again the choreography of Thor, people point to the field and tell what they know. They do not agree. Agreement is a luxury. But the telling is unanimous. Something was said that night, they say, and it wasn't by a man. Children, now grown into the shapes their mothers prayed for and their fathers doubted, walk the lane and feel a moment of cool on the skin where there is no shade. They call it the ghost of a wall. They stand and listen and hear, briefly, the grammar of wood, its subjunctive longing, its declarative end. The river keeps its counsel, but sometimes it braids foam into a rope and lays it on the bank like a memory someone forgot to carry away. The neighbours' houses learn manners. They lower their voices after sundown. They stop bragging in storms. A few of them, seeing how easily a ledger can inherit a match, ease their hands from the throats of things. Not many, enough that the air takes a new note into its chord. In church, Easter is still bright as brass, but a small company of saints in the windows looks less content, as if they have been reminded that resurrection without repentance is theatre. Among us, the legend chooses its bones. It does not take the names newspapers prefer. It takes the names we whisper when we are trying to locate ourselves in the dark. It takes the sound of spoons at dawn, the smell of shirts steamed by breath, the weight of keys in a pocket that did not own them. It takes a daughter's hair and makes from it a river crossing. It takes a ledger and leaves it deliberately unfinished, the way a story must remain if it wants to keep telling. Sometimes on Easter evenings a wind rises without reason and walks the length of the field like a man with a purpose he cannot confess. It pauses where the staircase once translated between floors. It leans over the place where the table rehearsed power. It curls around the spot where silver at last stopped reflecting lies. The wind does not rattle or roar, it listens, and those who are near enough to it, with the right kind of patience in their ears, hear a page turn in a book that no one is holding. What happened to the master depends on who is counting. Some say he rebuilt smaller and learned to bless what remained. Some say he hardened into a figure the children crossed the road to avoid. Some say he moved away and took his arithmetic with him to pebbles that had not yet been numbered. The house, for its part, did not return. Grass volunteered, a scatter of brick persisted like teeth in a jaw that still wanted to argue. Wildflowers staged their quiet coup. The field accepted them without oath. As for me, I walk with both names, mine and the one the day insists upon, fitted together now like boards that have agreed to share a nail. I carry thread, I carry silence, I carry the small, honest weight of a spoon. I pass the place and feel the earth's pulse slow to the drum I learned that night, not vengeance, not victory, something older and without a banner, a rightness that refuses applause. If you stand there at dusk, you can see the ledger as the sky writes it, lines of geese, entries of star, a margin where the moon keeps notes. You can almost touch the sum that never resolves, because to resolve would be to close the book on names still living. The story, like the field, requires rotation. Justice grows best when you let the land rest between harvests. People ask, sometimes, if the house had it coming. That is a chair I do not sit in. I say only that houses learn the character of their owners the way aprons learn the character of kitchens, and I say that on one Easter night in 1855, language found a tongue that does not lie, and it told the truth in a voice the county could not interrupt. After that, even the wind walked different. Listen, the ground keeps an ear where the staircase used to be. Footsteps pass now, some sorrow, some joy, and the ground tells them in its low, patient dialect, carry what you must, but do not drag the dead behind you like a plough. If you must keep a ledger, keep room for the uncounted. And if silence is your weapon, remember that it is also your hymn. The field darkens, frogs rehearse forgiveness, the river keeps the date. Somewhere a key, lost long ago, dreams of opening something that deserves it. Somewhere a needle waits, certain that repair is work without end. And in the cooling air, ash invisible as breath rises, turns, and is taken up into a sky that has learned, finally, to read. The page does not close, the margin does not end. The ledger remains, unfinished, as it should be, its last line written not in ink but in the careful hush of steps leaving the place without looking back.